Well, good evening or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our French Porcelain Society Ceramics Living Room Lecture. This is our 46th, I believe, living room lecture, but it's also our Sir Geoffrey de Bellaigue Memorial Lecture, our annual lecture that we host every year. And to those of you who've been with us earlier this afternoon for our AGM, welcome back. To everyone else, it's such a pleasure to welcome you to the French Porcelain Society. My name is Caroline McCaffrey-Harth, and I'm really pleased to be joined today, as always, by the wonderful Felix Zorzo, who helps put all of this together. And we're really delighted to be sort of whisked back to the 18th century today, thinking about the Ballet de Porcelain with our celebrated speaker, Dr. Meredith Martin, who's joining us from the US before she shortly joined us in the UK to actually showcase performances from this reimagined ballet that we'll be hearing more about, which will be taking place later this week on the 16th and 17th of June at Waddesdon, and then also at Brighton Pavilion as well. So I'm sure we'll be hearing quite a lot from that over the next hour or so. Without any further ado, then, I'd love to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Meredith Martin, who is Associate Professor of Art History at New York University and the Institute of Fine Arts. Meredith, known to many of you, I'm sure, is a specialist in French art and architecture from the 17th to 19th centuries. And she is, of course, the author of Dairy Queens, The Politics of Pastoral Architecture from Catherine de' Medici to Marie Antoinette, which was published in 2011 by Harvard University Press. And most recently, along with Gillian Weiss, The Sun King at Sea, Maritime Art and Galley Slavery in Louis XIV's France, which is a fantastic book recently published by Getty Research Institute Publications. She's currently been working on this upcoming Ballet de Porcelain, which she'll be speaking to us today. She's also working on a study of porcelain rooms from the 17th century to the present, and on an exhibition on the 1720 Mississippi and South Sea bubbles with the New York Public Library. So incredibly busy. So Meredith, thank you so much for joining us today. And we're really delighted to welcome you for our Sir Geoffrey de Bellaigue Memorial Lecture. And you'll be speaking to us on reimagining the Ballet de Porcelain, magic, desire, and exotic entanglement. So Meredith, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for having me. I hear the weather is beautiful in the UK today. It's very gray and rainy in Brooklyn, so it's a bit of a surprise, but you might hear a bit of street noise out my window, but otherwise I hope you can hear me okay. Is the volume level fine?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Okay, great. So thanks to Caroline and Felix for all the logistics of putting this together. And I also have to give a special shout out to my dear friend and colleague Mia Jackson, who's here, French Porcelain Society member extraordinaire, who's done all of the sort of planning, Herculean efforts, and brainstorming with me for the Waddesdon performances. And I'm really delighted to be here today and to share this project with all of you. I should have also mentioned the book which is titled Reimagining the Ballet de Porcelain, A Tale of Magic, Desire, and Exotic Entanglement, just came out last week. So we could perhaps include a link to that if any of you'd like to read more. There's a lovely essay by Mia and Kate Tunstall in it, as well as contributions from all of our many venues that are presenting this work. And my wonderful choreographer and co-creator Phil Chan, who you'll hear much more about, and who will be with me in the UK next week, along with our, hang on, let me make sure I can shift, along with our three principal dancers for this production, two of whom are from the New York City Ballet, Daniel Applebaum, our Teapot Prince on the left, Georgina Paz-Gauguin, our princess in center, of course, front and center, and then Tyler Haynes, who works primarily as a Broadway actor, who is our sorcerer, and you see him on the right. And you'll hear more about their roles, costumes, and everything else, but I couldn't help but start with this kind of lovely teaser image from a photo shoot that we did at the Cultural Services of the French Embassy last December, on the same day that we premiered this work in the galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So what I'd like to do today is for about half an hour or so, just walk you through this project, how it came about, the sort of process of reimagining and recreating it, say a little bit about the different venues, and then we can have a bit of a discussion, a Q&A. So, as Caroline mentioned, I'm a specialist in 18th century French art and architecture, and I also work a lot on French interactions with Asia during the early modern period. So I write a lot about objects as well as ambassadors and other peoples moving back and forth between these different territories. And I have written quite a lot, or have thought quite a lot, about the early modern phenomenon of the porcelain room, which no doubt many of you listening today are well familiar with this room type, which flourished in the 17th and early 18th centuries in different parts of Europe. Probably the best surviving example is this one on the left, the porcelain room at Charlottenburg, which was finished in the early 18th century and almost completely, I shouldn't say surviving really, it was almost completely destroyed during World War II, and it's been substantially restored with new porcelain bought on auction houses and on the market to kind of replicate its original appearance. And these porcelain rooms, which were commissioned by rulers, aristocrats, a lot of powerful women patrons who enjoyed this kind of creating and playing with this room type, typically featured hundreds or sometimes even thousands of pieces of porcelain, often Chinese blue and white porcelain, as well as other examples that were popular among European collectors at the time. And then later on, once Europeans finally figured out the technology of porcelain production, sometimes these rooms would include European porcelain, Meissen, and so on. And this porcelain would be interspersed or kind of set off with gilding, mirrors, lacquer decoration to really create this opulent and kind of shimmering all-over effect. A room in which sort of structure and decoration kind of falls apart or dematerializes. You have porcelain sometimes pressed directly into the plaster. And to really convey a sense of the kind of great esteem that porcelain had among European collectors and within the European imagination at the time, and some of the sense of kind of magic and mystery and desire that porcelain also held for European patrons. And now I know that among this group, oftentimes I've given this talk in different contexts for different audiences, and I sometimes have to convince listeners, of this kind of magic and mystery and seduction and even sexiness of porcelain in the early modern period. But I don't have to tell you all that. Porcelain rooms are fascinating to me for a number of different reasons. The ways in which they kind of attempt to showcase the perceived cosmopolitanism of their patrons, their connection to global trade networks, their interest in kind of technology and artisanal craft represented by this material. So I'm interested in the historical room type, and then I'm also interested in the way that contemporary artists have engaged with this type and kind of made it their own and have reimagined it in different ways in various kinds of installations that have taken place over the past several years. And just to give one example, in 2016, the American artist Arlene Sheckett, I think she was the first contemporary living artist to have an exhibition at the Frick Collection in New York. And she installed her contemporary ceramics, which were made from a multi-year residency that she had at the Meissen porcelain manufactory. She installed her work alongside examples of 18th century Meissen porcelain from the Henry Arnold collection in the Frick's new porcelain portico gallery. And the installation itself was inspired by Augustus the Strong's display of both Asian and European porcelain at his Japanese palace outside of Dresden. But she also took a lot of kind of playful liberties with this style. And what I really loved about the show is the ways in which she kind of conceptually engaged with and sort of tapped into certain ideas about porcelain at the time. Its connection to a sense of kind of liveliness or even animation, this interest in the kind of artisanal craft expertise of porcelain, and how she really made this kind of historic medium sort of come alive and take on new meaning for contemporary museum goers. And I was inspired, I gave a talk at the Frick about how her installation sort of engaged with the historical phenomenon of porcelain rooms. And I was really inspired by her creativity, and I kind of wanted to do something beyond the traditional, academic lecture or academic piece of writing, something kind of creative in my own work. And I've been trying to do that in a number of different ways over the past few years. But I'm not an artist. I don't make ceramics or anything else, and so I wasn't quite sure how to go about it. And I was talking to a good friend of mine about this, Esther Bell, who's a curator at the Clark in Williamstown, Mass. And she said, when I was in Paris a few years ago and I was researching my dissertation on the French painter Charles Coipel, I came across this libretto in a box in the archives of an archival box of sort of amateur theatrical works put on by an amateur theater troupe that this artist Coipel was associated with in the 18th century. And she said, I came across this libretto called the Ballet de Porcelain, or the Teapot Prince. And some of these ideas that you're interested in, kind of, porcelain objects coming to life, this sense of animation, I feel like some of that was in there. And next time you're in Paris, you should go and look this up. And so I did. And this is at the BNF. There's a couple of examples of it in the Arts du Spectacle library at Richelieu, and then there's another copy at the Arsenal library. This is a small ballet pantomime, which was put on only twice, as far as we know, in 1739 and 1741, and has been kind of lost to history ever since. It was written by the Comte de Caylus, who's known much more as a sort of antiquarian, kind of collector, amateur, but who also wrote plays, and in this case, this ballet. You can see the French title here, Le Prince Potete, and then it's sometimes also, as I said, referred to as the Ballet de Porcelain. And it's a very small kind of divertissement that was only about 15 minutes long and was part of a larger evening of theatrical performances that were staged at a aristocratic country house outside of Paris called the Château de Morville. And the host was the widow of the Comte de Morville, who was a Navy minister, a foreign minister, a member of a very kind of illustrious family who had served in that capacity for several decades. They were also big collectors of porcelain and other Asian luxury goods. And he and his wife and subsequent widow sponsored this kind of amateur theater troupe. And they staged a lot of these types of productions. And this box in the archives has several of them. This is one example. It's one of the very few that survives, not just with the libretto, but also with the score, the original Baroque score, which was composed by Nicolas Racot de Grandval, who's not very well known at all. It's kind of in the vein of Rameau, and it's a really beautiful standard Baroque structure where you have a ritornelle, a sarabande, a vaudeville, which is something that the audience could kind of sing along to. It was a tune or words that they were familiar with. And then a contredanse at the end, kind of inspired by the English country dance, where you have people all coming together. Possibly audience members could have performed this dance as well. And then I will show you at the very end our reimagined sort of vision of the sarabande, which is danced by the princess. But it's a gorgeous score, and I don't read music myself. So when I first kind of came across this manuscript, it wasn't the music is beautiful, as you'll hear, but that wasn't what immediately kind of struck me or spoke to me. It was reading the libretto and this sort of first scene of these dancers who kind of spin around and transform into porcelain vases just really kind of struck me as this, just visually and kind of viscerally, this amazing image. It's kind of in the same vein, same literary milieu as Beauty and the Beast. And in fact, Beauty and the Beast was published a year after the first performance of the Ballet de Porcelain in 1739. And the author, Madame de Villeneuve, was kind of a member of this amateur circle. The story itself is inspired by an anonymous fairy tale. So Caylus kind of wrote it after this tale called Le Prince Periné, or the L'Origine des Pagodes, the origin of pagodes, which is this type of porcelain figurine. I'll show you an example a bit later on, that was popular at the time, kind of inspired by Chinese Budai type figures. And the fairy tale tells the story of an Asian sorcerer who rules a blue island, or an island of porcelain, and he's transformed all of the inhabitants as well as trespassers into porcelain. There's a prince who gets stranded on the island, and the sorcerer turns him into a teapot. And then a princess who comes onto the island and has to save her lover by kind of seducing the sorcerer, stealing his wand, breaking the spell, and bringing everyone back to life. So it's a bit of a sort of reverse on the standard damsel in distress scene. She becomes kind of the heroine who ends up defeating the sorcerer. And in the fairy tale, the prince and princess turn the sorcerer into one of these pagode figures. But in Caylus' ballet, the sorcerer just kind of runs off stage. And there's different ways to think about this work. You could think about it as a kind of standard fairy tale love story, you know, with all the kind of typical conventions of the time. But you could also think about it as a kind of allegory for this European desire to kind of know and steal or sort of seize the secrets of porcelain manufacture. And that's basically what the prince and princess do at the end. They take the sorcerer's wand, they steal his magic, you know, and they make him into a porcelain figure. And, you know, this was written and produced at a time when, you know, European artists and collectors were, you know, they'd been trying for centuries, and they'd finally kind of figured out, not yet in France, but at Meissen certainly, the sort of secrets of hard-paced porcelain production, and they were very interested in kind of, you know, making it their own. So there are a few things that were running through my mind as I was reading through this libretto. First of all, this desire to resurrect this lost work. You know, it's been like Sleeping Beauty in a box for 3 centuries, to bring it back to life, but also to kind of engage with, you know, the politics and the history of this story. So the first thing to say is, you know, what do we know and what do we don't know about it? There's very little that survives. It's just the score, which is pretty schematic, pretty bare bones, and the music. There's no surviving examples of costumes, no sets, no choreography, no movement. It wasn't notated like other dances at the time. That's fairly typical for ballet pantomime, but even so, it's this kind of, you know, tabula rasa, which was a great challenge, but also a kind of great opportunity. There's a bit of a description of at least one of the performances. You know, I said there's one 1739, one 1741. At least one of them took place outdoors in the gardens of the chateau, and actually at Waddesdon. It's the only venue of our, I think, 12, 13 venues where we're going to have it outside, so it's really going to recreate that magic. And it was against a kind of pièce d'eau, this water feature, where you had what's described, it's a description of a party that was thrown on the occasion of this ballet. Porcelain vases that were lining the water. Maybe it was actually like cardboard cutouts of porcelain vases. And then a kind of illuminated archway in the center with a big teapot right there. And then the dancers performed in front of this backdrop, and the musicians would have been kind of lined up alongside them. And then at that time, the Comte de Morville, or his widow, had the servants of the house dress up in cardboard cutouts of porcelain and kind of move through the space in a sort of what was described as a kind of grotesque fashion. They were kind of comic relief, and they were meant to imitate the inhabitants of this island that had been made into porcelain. So this Engelbrecht print of, you know, part of a series of artisans morphing into the tools of their trade. This kind of gives some sort of a sense of maybe that original design, while this festival print from Versailles from many decades before the ballet gives you a little bit of a sense of the kind of, you know, mise en scène at the Château de Morville. You know, and I mentioned the family had been, you know, they were very actively involved as foreign ministers in the Asia trade, and they were big collectors themselves of both Asian objects, porcelain, but also chinoiserie. And they commissioned Watteau, the French artist Watteau, to design a Chinese cabinet for another one of their chateaux at La Muette in the early 18th century. The room's been dismantled, but here's a couple of paintings that survive from it. And this also evokes maybe a bit of a sense of what, you know, the original ballet might have looked like in terms of costumes, palette, you know, so on and so forth. So we had to really kind of draw upon analogous sort of images and objects and ideas at the time in recreating this work. There are also, you know, other chinoiserie productions, the most famous which came a little bit after the Ballet de Porcelain, so it's possible that it inspired works like Nevers' Les Fêtes Chinoises, which was about a decade after the Ballet de Porcelain, and the artist Francois Boucher designed the sets for Les Fêtes Chinoises, which was also performed later in London. And this cartoon, this painting for a tapestry series, gives some sort of a sense of Boucher's designs, which no longer survive. And then you have prints, costume designs, images of the time of Chinese figures, which give a sense of what the sorcerer, his sort of movement, his stance, his costume, what it might have looked like. And you can see these very kind of these gestures that became kind of coded and stereotyped and sort of racialized over time to signify Chinese or Asian characters. This deep knee bend, the pointed raised elbows and sort of pointed fingers, as well as the mustache and other kinds of gestures. And these are described, you had sort of Chinese rulers performing more in a kind of noble style, but most of these characters throughout the 18th century dance in what's described also as a sort of grotesque mode. And their bodies and gestures, deliberately signify their otherness, and they're contrasted to the kind of noble dance style of European elites with its sort of sense of, sort of upward poise, elegance, symmetry, and balance. It's really different from this dance type. Another inspiration, of course, that we took was from porcelain itself that was popular at the time, and I went into the archives and was able to kind of find some of the examples of porcelain, analogous examples of types of porcelain that the family collected: blue and white, Capodimonte, Celadon, and then also the Comte de Morville liked Meissen, collected some teapots. I don't know whether it actually had chinoiserie decoration, but this was the kind of work that I ended up sending to our really wonderful costume designer, Harriet Jung, who was inspired by Capodimonte designs in particular, for the designs that she created for the ballet, for our musicians, who I'll show you a photograph in a minute, but she designed these beautiful robes for our kind of early music ensemble of 5 musicians who play live. And they become our kind of porcelain forest or set. We didn't want to recreate the idea of, servants in the house running around for a lot of different reasons. One of them is also just budget, and we really wanted to feature our 3 protagonists, sort of in the center. So we've costumed our musicians instead, and they've become part of our moving set. And then you have the princess dress, and then a photograph of our sorcerer and teapot prince from the Met production. And then, I mentioned that I would show you an image of pagode figures. So here's some examples. At the far left, this is a masquerade costume for a dancing pagode by Jean Bérin from the court of Louis XIV. A Meissen kind of nodding pagode, and then actually a trade card that the Comte de Caylus, the author of the libretto, made for the art dealer Jacinthe, who was Watteau's art dealer and who renamed his shop à la pagode right around the time of the ballet, in homage to the kind of popularity of this figurine and other Asian luxury goods. And I've always wondered whether this might have been a kind of nodding in the original fairy tale that the ballet is based on. The teapot prince kind of crawls up on top of a doorway and flings himself onto the sorcerer to sort of facilitate like the breaking of the spell and the transformation into a pagode. And I wonder if there's some kind of little witty invocation of that in this trade card. But anyway, what you can also see is the ways in which pagodes became themselves kind of stereotypical embodiments of otherness and of kind of signifying Asian characters or Chinese characters. And they had, some of the porcelain figurines had movable hands and necks and even tongues. And descriptions of dancing pagodes from the time suggest the ways in which these, this art form and this kind of choreographic mode really inspired one another in a certain sense. I'm not sure what, chicken and egg, but the description of Bérin's costume, for instance, that accompanies this image explains that the dancer that you see, that his crossed legs here are actually fake. They're made of like paper mache, and the dancer's actual legs are inside the pedestal base, and he's connected to this base by suspenders. And so when he jumps up and down, almost like a bobbing figure, almost like a kind of human Jack-in-the-Box, it makes this sort of very again, like quote unquote grotesque gesture. And you can think about how that's contrasted to, European dancers performing in the kind of danse noble mode. And just to give you a sense of an example of a type of ballet that was notated from an earlier period in this very beautiful form of Beauchamp-Fourier notation, this records sort of the dancer's feet kind of moving down stage, and there's this sense again of kind of symmetry and fluidity and a contrast that may have been operative, seems to have been kind of operative in the distinction between sort of the prince and princess in the ballet and the sorcerer. So, I said I wanted to, examine and engage with kind of the history and the politics of this work, but I didn't want to reiterate or reify any of these stereotypes. I wanted to kind of more challenge them. So I needed to find a collaborator, a creative collaborator who would be great for that. And I was quite lucky. Early on, I applied for a fellowship at NYU's Center for Ballet and the Arts to try to work on this project. And through the CBA, the Center for Ballet and the Arts, I met my really wonderful co-creator, choreographer, Phil Chan, who's become well known in the ballet world over the past several years for this advocacy organization that he co-founded, actually with our porcelain princess, Georgina Paz-Gauguin, called Final Bow for Yellowface. And it's devoted to kind of questioning and eliminating offensive stereotypes or portrayals of Asian figures in European ballet. So they've worked with Peter Martins of the New York City Ballet and many other dance artistic directors and dance companies on toning down some of the racialized stereotypes in the Nutcracker, the Chinese tea dance in the Nutcracker, which is this kind of iconic production that continues to get performed sometimes literally in Yellowface or using certain sorts of coded, conventionalized costumes, makeup, gestures. And he's gotten almost every major dance company in the US and many throughout the world to sign the pledge to no longer perform in, this kind of Yellowface. So I heard about his work and I immediately emailed him out of the blue and just said, I'm doing this project. It's a Baroque divertissement, but I want you to do this with me. And are you interested? He'd never had any of a kind of Baroque dance background. He was raised in Hong Kong. He danced for Alvin Ailey. He also was trained in kind of a Chinese classical dance tradition and even some kind of Chinese acrobatic tradition, but he was game and he took it on, and it just turned into this wonderful, serendipitous collaboration for the two of us. So we made several different artistic choices in, not just resurrecting, but really reimagining the work. One of the key choices is in casting. So we've reimagined the sort of European prince and princess are being danced by two Asian American soloists from the New York City Ballet, Daniel Applebaum and Georgina Paz-Gauguin. And then we've also reimagined our Chinese sorcerer, and we've turned him into a kind of mad European porcelain collector on the model of Augustus the Strong. And so you can see Tyler in his crazy Baroque wig in the image on the top left. Is the scene where he's transforming Daniel into a teapot, a kind of pantomime scene that Phil has added. We also hired a mostly creative team of artists of Asian descent. So Harriet Jung, for instance, is our costume designer. We added a little bit of contemporary music to the original Baroque score, so it's about 20 minutes rather than 15. And we hired the Filipino-American sound designer Sugar Vendel to add that music, which you'll hear a bit in just a moment. We worked with a Baroque dance specialist, Patricia Beeman, who was a ballerina for many years with the New York Baroque Dance Company, on some of the Baroque movement. But Phil also, and it's very much completely choreographed by him. I have no dance background whatsoever, so he's done all the choreography. And he's infused some of his own Chinese classical tradition in the fan dance, that's the sarabande, and in other parts of the production. So the wonderful principal dancer from Martha Graham, Zhen Ying, worked with Phil on this on the choreography of this sarabande and other works. And then, as I mentioned, we have costumed our musicians, and we've integrated that contemporary sound with the full original Baroque score. We haven't changed that at all. It's just interspersed with a bit of this sound. And we've likened this approach. Phil actually came up with this metaphor, which I think is quite beautiful and kind of perfect, to the technique of kintsugi, the Japanese technique of repairing broken ceramics with gold or lacquer infill, which doesn't disguise the sort of points of breakage, but is intended to kind of make those points stronger and even more beautiful with these additions. You know, and this is a historical ballet that comes to us in fragments, and we've, you know, tried to kind of not, you know, shy away from those any sort of problematic aspects or imperfections of the work, and have acknowledged that there was a lot of holes that we had to fill in, but we hope that, you know, we've created something that is maybe, you know, as beautiful as the original, or even more beautiful in terms of the way that Phil has approached it creatively. And, you know, there's a lot of contemporary artists, including the Korean artist Lee Seok-young, who have kind of worked with, invoked this kintsugi technique in their own work recently. I'm almost finished, and then I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes of footage from one of our productions. But I'll just quickly show you the different places where we've performed. We premiered at the Met, as I mentioned, in the Petrie Court, which was, we served as the kind of opening divertissement or entertainment for their inspiring Walt Disney show, which was curated by Wolf Burchard, who was a wonderful participant member of our team, who was really instrumental in bringing it to the Met. And his show is now at the Wallace Collection. So I think there may be people here who have seen it and been involved in that show, and hopefully they might be able to come to Waddesdon to see one of the performances. So, you know, that show was about the influence of 18th century decorative arts on Disney animation and sound design. So there's a lot of set design. So there's Beauty and the Beast and all sorts of interesting kind of synergies with our project. Then we had two kind of academic university engagements at University of Chicago and Princeton. Oakland City Ballet, who've acquired the rights to our production, they're going to start taking it over and putting it in their permanent repertory this fall. And they'll perform at MIT and also Peabody Essex in the Boston area and in Salem. And then the 4 venues on our European tour: Waddesdon, Brighton, then we go to Capodimonte and Palazzo Grassi. We've sadly had to kind of postpone the live performances in Paris for a later date, but we are going to have a colloque at INHA as well as a film. We're going to do a screening of the production in early July. And I'm happy, you know, to send out any more information about these dates if you're interested, and you can see some of the gorgeous sort of mise en scène places where we'll be. Waddesdon will be in the music room at Brighton. I think it's the first time they've had a ballet in that space. At the Capodimonte, we're going to be in an 18th century music salon, but here's the wonderful porcelain room from Portici that's been reinstalled at Capodimonte. And then we'll be in the atrium of the Palazzo Grassi in Venice. And that's just our team with the 3 dancers, Phil and myself. And now what I would like to do is just to, I think, Caroline, can I take a couple minutes to show a bit of
yes,
footage?
absolutely. Please
Okay.
do. I'm sure we'd love all of it.
Great. Let me just come out of my... Okay, so what I'm going to show you here, I will open this up. And this is a bit of footage from our Chicago production, which we performed with the Haymarket Opera Company. They are our Baroque musicians. There's a harpsichordist, 2 violinists, a theorbo player, and a viola da gamba player. And then this is just a bit of a snippet of the scene right after Daniel, the prince, is turned into a teapot, and Georgina, our princess, comes onto the island and is sort of looking for him, and she dances a very mournful saraband because she can't find him. And then the sorcerer kind of comes upon her. So there's about a minute of her dancing alone, and then about a minute or so of Tyler trying to kind of engage with her in a way. And the sound won't be perfect, but hopefully you'll hear it well enough. And you'll hear at the beginning a bit of Sugar Vendel's, you know, the kintsugi music, the contemporary music that will be played prior to the Baroque score. So let me turn it on. Okay, I'll stop there. So you can see that, he thinks the sorcerer thinks she'll be impressed by him bringing out his sort of toy, his plaything that he's created, this teapot prince, not knowing that it's the lover that she's searching for. Anyway, I will stop sharing now. Oh, here we all are. But I'm happy to take any. Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm sorry. Let me share. I know you wanted to. Let me come back for 1 second to the last image. Here we go. We can keep this on if you want, Caroline, or if you want to announce this, and then we can go into the Q&A, whatever
That's
works.
perfect. If I sort of announce it, but first of all, Meredith, I have to say thank you so much it's just fantastic to hear all about your incredibly creative, but I think also very much collaborative process, and to
Yes.
kind of trace that through from someone recommending you something in the archive to then going and finding it in that journey of discovery that as historians we want to go on, and we love when that happens, but then all the challenges that follow. So, and to see it, to see that clip, and also hopefully to come and see it in Waddesdon on the 16th and 17th of June, and then also in Brighton Pavilion in the music room. I mean, that's incredible. So thank you so much for sharing this wonderful project with us all. We will go to Q&A in a minute, so if you have got questions for Meredith, please do put them into the chat. But just before that, as Meredith rightly says, we do want to shout about our fantastic 2-day symposium to celebrate the birth of Madame de Pompadour, and also Dame Rosalind Savile's fantastic new book on Pompadour and her Sèvres porcelain, our conference Everyday Rococo, Madame de Pompadour and the Arts, which is taking place at a changed venue. It's now being held at the Gorvey Lecture Theatre at the Victoria and Albert Museum on Friday the 1st and Saturday the 2nd of July. You can book online for that, and I think Felix is very kindly putting information about the booking for that into the chat. And we also will have a drinks reception that evening on the Friday the 1st, very kindly hosted by some of the auction houses at Savile's, and then we'll also have dinner that evening. So it will be set to be a fantastic event, 2-day event, speaking on fashion, on prints, gems, furniture, architecture, books, pets, and of course porcelain. So please do try and join us for that if you can. But I think you can probably stop sharing, Meredith, and then hopefully we can come to some questions. I mean, I have quite a few, so I might just kick off, because I think what I find so interesting is the collaborative nature of this whole process. And I just wonder, do you feel, actually having gone through this, you're maybe thinking about things in a slightly different way as a historian of 18th century France? The fact that you've been talking about choreography, but also music, the costumes, the setting, the audience, it's bringing together so many different things. How has that maybe informed your practice? Or do you think, you said at the beginning you were sort of searching for creativity, you've definitely found that, I think, but do you think that's something that as you move forward you might keep trying to kind of look back to, or is this sort of a one-off? It's been a lot of work, clearly, from all of the things that you've been speaking about.
Yeah, yes, thank you for that question. I mean, it's been an extraordinary experience. It's also been really exhausting. I'm happy that Oakland is going to take it over, and I think I was a bit naive in what the all-encompassing role of the producer, what it actually entails. There's nights where it's like 11 p.m. and I'm like washing the sorcerer's tights and thinking like next time I'm getting like more. I do have a wonderful wardrobe manager, Elisa Casato, who's been studying with me. She's from Italy. She has a Marie Curie fellowship, so she's been helping with some of the costumes, but it's there's a lot. But it has been, it's been wonderful to do something a bit more creative, a bit more public facing. And, Phil's advocacy work has been really inspiring for me. And I think, his approach, which is not, he's not a specialist of the 18th century. And sometimes we kind of, there's moments when my historian's hat, like when Harriet Jung, for instance, says, the porcelain designs that she loved are kakiyama. And I'm like, well, it's sort of Japanese and it's Chinese, but I kind of have to let some things go. I think what's so great about collaborative work in general, but especially this type of project where people really have their own domain of expertise. But for me, certainly there's a limit where I bump up against like what I can and cannot do. And it's kind of wonderful to open myself up to that. And it does make me think about, the ways that I approach and and write history and try to make it kind of relevant and meaningful, without taking too many liberties, but allowing others, artists, to approach it in different ways. So it's also, what's great is if anyone's inspired to come, like you should come to Waddesdon and Brighton because it's also different. Performing arts is different every time you do it, right? But even more so in this kind of with this approach because each setting is very different. The dimensions, Phil has to kind of adjust the choreography slightly depending on whether the audience is in the round or so there's just so much that kind of goes into that thinking and rethinking over and over again.
Actually, I think the fact that it's being held in the gardens at Waddesdon, as you said, that links back to its original performance is actually something so feels very special about that actually to really kind of connect back to that. And of course then you're bringing in the signs of wildlife or I don't know whatever you have, perhaps weather, hopefully praying for good weather. Mia, absolutely sending good vibes that way to Waddesdon. But I think it is fascinating the fact that you're bringing it to all these different areas and locations, and the fact that actually it was linked to the Met at the opening for the Disney exhibition is fantastic to really allow us to reinterpret these very well-known stories, or in this case, very little known story, and think about it in a slightly different way through kind of the animation of objects, which is so beautifully done through the ballet. I'm trying to see if we've got some questions coming in, so please do send them. I think we've had a couple of questions come in. If you could say a bit more about the kind of links between social class within chinoiserie and contemporary understanding of chinoiserie at this point. We've had a question in particular about the grotesque modes that were often used or kind of understood by Europeans for showing the otherness of of what they saw as an exotic figure. Was that linked to class? If you could say a bit more on that.
I mean, in some cases, yes. I mean, that kind of comic grotesque was also very typical of certain characters in the Commedia dell'arte tradition, which kind of overlaps a bit with the ballet pantomime. And so you have like figures like Harlequin, who sometimes represents a kind of, peasant farmer. So there's a class dimension there, but also is racialized in certain cases, sometimes performs in blackface and actually performed at least once as a pagode figure. There's a book, Pagodas in Play, which talks about 18th century chinoiserie and Italian dance and theater and those traditions. So there is a bit of, and I think the pagode figures, like if you have some of the early Versailles masquerades, would feature sort of the ruler of China and then kind of the retinue. And so I think like the grotesque dancing pagodes would be the sort of lower members of the court. So I think there is a bit of a class dimension or overlap there, but not always. I mean, sometimes it's really just meant to signal a kind of exotic otherness that becomes over time, not always, but certainly over time as Europe's own sort of attitude towards Asia becomes, or policies become more aggressive, more sort of imperialist, that sense of the kind of hierarchy gets more and more pronounced, and dance certainly plays into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting the fact that you decided through the kind of collaboration with Phil to turn everything on its head, as it were. And actually, particularly it was when you mentioned about the Maladie de Porcelain and actually kind of, showing the sorcerer almost like an Augustus the Strong figure. Was that something you thought about from the beginning, or is that really, did that evolve quite organically throughout the process? Because that is especially for us, that kind of China mania is so key to porcelain at this point in the 18th century.
I think Phil immediately saw Georgina Pazcogen, in sort of the role of the princess, and that made us, I think that was often like right from the beginning, this kind of flip, that inversion, and not so much to like invert the hierarchy, but to really kind of raise this question about, who gets represented with a sense of kind of depth, humanity, nuance, a sort of agency, who gets to move and how in that period. So it's more about a kind of questioning of roles. We also, I should have mentioned at the beginning, I was so inspired by Arlene Sheckett installation, by her contemporary designs, but also by the 18th century Meissen, from Henry Arnold's collection. And actually the Arnold family and the Arnold Family Foundation were big early like champions and supporters of this project, which was really wonderful. So the kind of Meissen, that piece of it was there from the beginning, and how to kind of rethink it. But that was Phil, in conversation with the two of us. We spent hours early on, like going through, he'd never really paid attention to the kind of porcelain and the Met's galleries. And I think he, for our book, the title of his essay, which really beautifully lays out his whole thought process and his whole kind of creative process, it's called My Porcelain Sickness. So it also speaks
It's
to how he became sort of enamored with this history and with these objects
yeah,
too.
it infects everyone, whether you think it will or not. And actually, on that point, we have had a question. You mentioned coming to this libretto through your work on the porcelain rooms and your work, of course, at the Frick collection. And we've had a question come through. If you could say a bit more about the porcelain rooms, particularly you mentioned their association to powerful women. Can you develop on that just a little bit? I know that's not necessarily the subject of today, but we've had that
No,
question
but of
come through.
course. I mean, well, an early Amalia van Solms, who was the wife of the Dutch stadholder, was one of the earliest kind of patrons, and maybe even a kind of instigator of this, creative force behind this room type and the way that she displayed her porcelain on these kind of étagères, like gilded shelves, sometimes were, painted with like red lacquer, which became a common sort of visual conceit that her daughters were inspired by her mode of display, and in all of their different, Oranienburg, different residences that they themselves kind of took up and furnished. They perpetuated that tradition. It wasn't quite as strong. You have, of course, the Trianon de Porcelain, built kind of love nest for Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan. Not really so much that sort of prototype of the porcelain room per se. It's almost like a porcelain room kind of turned inside out. But it certainly had a very strong tradition, and even in Naples and Capodimonte, Maria Amalia, Augustus the Strong's granddaughter, who sort of like perpetuates this style of display. So even if the women themselves aren't credited, they're kind of behind the scenes playing a big role. And that also, in the ballet itself, the way in which, we love the fact that the princess becomes, sort of plays such a, she's really the most powerful kind of protagonist at the end. And we've certainly amplified that. Phil has amplified that in terms of the choreography and the pantomime. So
that's really brilliant, actually, having her agency at the center of that. I'm just aware of time, but maybe I'll go towards a sort of final wrapping up question. We've had a couple of questions come in about sort of next steps and the legacy in the future. And of course, you mentioned that the rights of the production were going to Oakland. We've also had a question if you're hoping to sort of share the story and the ballet with wider ballet schools and companies across the world. And of course, hopefully the tour will help with that. Could you say a bit more about, I guess, the legacy and the kind of future plans for this project?
yes, I mean it's really important, and we really hope it will have a long afterlife. Phil himself, his own sort of choreographic career, he's written a couple of books partly about his advocacy work, and then another that he's just finished on the history of Orientalism in ballet. But he's now, really in demand as a choreographer. He's going to do a Madame a Butterfly for the Boston Lyric Opera and various other things. So, we're happy that Oakland is going to kind of take over. And we hope to be performing, on the West Coast and in other venues as well. And they also, in addition to continuing to book for museum venues or, other institutions, they plan to bring it into a lot of Bay Area high schools. So, in terms of like the diversity, accessibility, that those components of the work, and really the kind of pedagogical dimensions of that's going to be a big part of what they want to do with it. Some of our, at Waddesdon, we'll be performing for a school group, and we've done that at Princeton as well. And so we are really interested in reaching multiple, ages, as well as different kinds of audiences. So, I myself am going to have to like hang up my my hat at some point and move on with my life. But I really hope it will have a rich afterlife.
That's brilliant. No, myself as well. I really hope so. And it's brilliant that you're showing it to schools, across the world. And that's so fantastic to get them interested, not only in ballet and history of the 18th century in France and something slightly, rethinking those kind of ideas that you've been discussing so brilliantly as well. So I think we're almost at time. So Meredith, final thing really to say is a huge thank you to taking the time to give us this fantastic lecture. I know you're literally about to fly off to come to us in the UK.
Tomorrow,
I'm wishing
yes,
you
tomorrow.
and Mia all the best, and all of the staff at Waddesdon, and also of course at Brighton Pavilion for the upcoming performances. And to make sure that if you'd like to, please do come along to Waddesdon later this week. You can find out more information in the links that we've posted in the chat, and also do book your tickets for our Madame de Pompadour Symposium on the 1st and 2nd of July at the V&A Museum. And other than that, have a fantastic evening, everyone. We're ending at a slightly earlier time today, so I hope you can all go and enjoy what seems to be still a very sunny day here in London. But finally, Meredith, a huge thank you and good luck with the production and your trip overseas.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. And please, I see something, saw briefly in the chat. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can find me on the New York University, art history website. We'd love to meet some of you in person if you're able to come, and hopefully, Caroline, we can meet at some point, and Felix as well. And I really appreciate you all taking the time on a Sunday to listen. So take care, everyone. Bye
Thanks
bye.
so much. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye.